A board of guardians stands in a gravel forecourt in the English Midlands in the spring of 1880, admiring a building they are rather proud of. It is new. The brick still carries a faint, pink warmth that will weather to soot grey within a decade, and the mortar between the courses has not yet taken on the permanent damp stain of an English winter. 3 stories rise in a careful cross shape, wings radiating from a central hall the way the architect intended, so that a single supervisor standing at the hub can see down every corridor at once without moving his feet. A bell tower sits above the entrance block, ready to mark the hours of rising, eating, and labor for the hundreds of souls who will shortly be living inside it. The windows are tall enough to look handsome from the road, and narrow enough that no one standing at them will see very much of the sky. A reporter from the county paper has come to admire it too, and he will later write that the new Union Workhouse is commodious, airy, and a credit to the parish that built it. The design belongs to a man named Sampson Kempthorne, an architect who drew a set of model workhouse plans in 1835 for the Poor Law Commissioners in London, and those plans, or close variations on them, were built in market towns and county seats across England through the middle decades of the century. Cross shape was not an aesthetic choice. It was a machine for sorting people. Each arm of the cross could hold a different class of inmate. The aged apart from the able-bodied apart from the children, men apart from women, and the whole arrangement supervised from a single point, the way a jailer watches a jail, because that, in most of the particulars that mattered, is precisely what it was. Stand back from it on this particular morning, and it reads as a monument to a certain kind of Victorian confidence. Confidence that poverty could be organized. Confidence that suffering, properly administered, could be made orderly, hygienic, even improving. The guardians in their good coats walk the gravel path, discussing ventilation and drainage and the price of the brick, satisfied that they have built something rational, something modern, something that will do exactly what it was designed to do. Beneath the fresh mortar and the careful brickwork and the newspaperman's admiring paragraph in the wards those narrow windows lit so poorly, a very different story was already beginning. It was a story about hunger measured out by the ounce, about husbands who would not see their wives again for months at a time, though both of them lived under the same roof, about children raised behind those walls who would leave them only for a factory floor or a coalface. It was a story about a piece of old tarred rope handed to a woman with bleeding fingers, and a pile of animal bones handed to a man whose stomach had not been full in 3 days. It is a story far more complicated, far more uncomfortable, and far more human than any county newspaper of 1880 was ever going to print. This is that story told the way it actually happened, to the people it actually happened to. This is England, 1880. Queen Victoria has been on the throne for 43 years. The railways have stitched the country together, and the factories of the Midlands and the North are producing goods at a volume the world has never seen. It is, by any measure that mattered to the newspapers of the day, an age of progress. It is also an age in which a shockingly large share of the population lived one bad season, one lost job, or one long illness away from complete destitution, with no savings, no safety net, and no legal recourse except one: the workhouse. A system that every single person in every stratum of that society understood existed, and that the comfortable classes had collectively agreed to discuss as little as possible, the way one might discuss a smell coming from beneath the floorboards. This video is that discussion, not the version in the county newspaper. The real one, built from the records the poor law unions themselves kept, From the parliamentary inquiries their own scandals forced open, from the diaries and the casebooks and the decades of archival work that historians like Peter Higginbotham have spent cataloguing so that this system would not simply be allowed to fade into a vague, sanitized idea of Dickensian hardship, we are going to walk through the intake process, the labor, the food, the punishments, the disease, and what happened to the body itself once the person inside it had died with no one left to claim it. We are going to meet a family who entered a workhouse very much like this one in the same year, and we are going to stay with them through what came next. Before we go further, if this kind of honest history is something you value, if you would rather sit with the real version of the past than the comfortable one, the portraits the newspapers preferred, take a moment to subscribe. It helps keep these evenings going. And if you would like to, leave a word in the comments about which corner of history you would most like to see uncovered next. I read every one of them. Because the principle behind that brick building in the forecourt was not an accident of budget or a failure of good intentions. It was written down, argued for, and passed into law. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 rebuilt the entire system of relief for the poor around a single doctrine. One, the commissioners themselves called the principle of less eligibility, and it stated, in effect, that the condition of a person receiving relief inside a workhouse should never be made as comfortable as the condition of the poorest laborer surviving outside one, on his own, unaided. Comfort was not an oversight to be corrected. It was the one outcome the system existed to prevent. A workhouse succeeding by its own internal logic was a workhouse that people were willing to do almost anything rather than enter, and the men who designed the system, chief among them a lawyer named Nassau Sr. and a civil servant named Edwin Chadwick, considered that willingness the entire point. Let us begin, then, where this particular story began. Not with the doors of the workhouse, with the person who was about to walk through them. His name was Joseph Radley, and in the autumn of 1879 he was 40 years old, a bootmaker by trade, and until quite recently a man who had never imagined he would see the inside of a union workhouse in his life. He was not a large man. 20 years bent over a last had rounded his shoulders and thickened the calluses on his palms into something closer to leather than skin, and his eyesight, once sharp enough to set the smallest stitches in a gentleman's dress boot by lamplight, had begun to blur at exactly the range his work required most. He had trained as a hand bootmaker in the traditional way, apprenticed at 14, and for most of his working life, that trade had kept a roof over his family and food, if not abundant food, on the table. But the 1,870 seconds had not been kind to men like Joseph. The boot and shoe trade, centered heavily in towns across Northamptonshire and spreading outward, was being transformed by machinery, by soul-sewing machines and factory production lines that could turn out a dozen pairs of boots in the time it took Joseph to finish one by hand and turn them out more cheaply besides. Small workshops like the one where he had spent his career closed in a slow, grinding sequence throughout the decade, and by the time his own employer shut the doors for good in the spring of 1879. Joseph was 40 years old, with a specialized skill that the market increasingly had no use for. His wife Ellen was 35 and had spent her marriage doing precisely what was expected of a respectable working woman of her station, keeping the household, taking in mending and washing when money was short, raising 3 children in 2 rented rooms that she scrubbed with a diligence bordering on ferocity. Their eldest, Alice, was 9, old enough to help mind her younger brother, and to understand, in the particular unspoken way that poor children understand things, that something in the household had gone quietly and seriously wrong. Walter was 6. The baby, George, had just turned 1, And it was George's constant hunger, more than anything else, that finally broke Ellen's resistance to the idea neither of them had said aloud for months. What the neighbors saw in the last weeks before it happened was a family managing. That was the performance expected. The respectable poor, Joseph and Ellen, gave it with real skill. He still shaved most mornings. She still swept the front step. What they did not see was the furniture disappearing piece by piece. To the pawnbroker, a chair, then a second chair, then the small mirror Ellen had brought into the marriage as part of her modest trousseau. Then finally the bed itself, so that by December the family of 5 was sleeping on the bare floor of a single room. Joseph had a private habit, one he had never confessed to his wife, of walking to the yard behind the old workshop some mornings and standing outside the locked door as though his old job might simply reappear if he waited long enough. He was, in the specific and unglamorous way that mattered most, an ordinary man who had run out of options in a system that offered him exactly one more. It was Ellen, in the end, who said the word first, on a night in early January, when George would not stop crying from hunger, and there was no coal left for the grate. Not the poorhouse, not the almshouse, the softened word polite people preferred. The workhouse. And 2 days later, having sold the last saleable object they owned and eaten the last of the food it had bought them, the Radley family walked the 3 miles from their rooms to the gates of the Millbrook Union Workhouse, carrying between the 5 of them almost nothing at all. We will follow them through what happened next, but first the door itself and everything it was built to take from the people who walked through it. The General Consolidated Order of 1847 required every union workhouse in England to follow the same first procedure for every new pauper, regardless of which county the workhouse stood in, regardless of the season, regardless of who that person had been the day before they arrived. If you picture that first hour at all, you probably picture something like checking into a very poor sort of lodging house. A clerk takes your name. Someone shows you to a bed. Perhaps there is a little embarrassment, a little awkwardness. And then the business of survival begins. That is not what happened, and the gap between the two versions is where this story actually starts. A family arriving at a union workhouse in 1880 did not walk through a door and become residents. They walked through a door and became inmates, a specific legal and administrative category, and the process of becoming one began immediately in a small building near the gate called the receiving ward, sometimes just the porter's lodge, and the circumstances of destitution in a leather-bound admissions book that survives in many unions to this day. From that moment, husband, wife, and children were no longer, administratively speaking, a family at all. They were separate entries on separate lines. Next came the bath, and this is where the intake process crossed from bureaucratic into physical. New arrivals were required to strip and bathe before being issued workhouse clothing, ostensibly for cleanliness and to control the lice and skin disease that traveled easily among the destitute. In practice, across a great many unions, this meant a shared tub of water used by one inmate after another, with only occasional changing, sometimes only between sexes, rather than between individuals. The historian Peter Higginbotham, who has spent decades combing surviving workhouse minute books and poor law board correspondence, has documented case after case in which guardians and inspectors themselves complained about exactly this practice, tepid, reused bathwater, and about the fact that a busy reception day could see a dozen or more strangers washed in succession in the same few inches of water. It was not universal. Some unions maintained better standards than others, and inspection reports from the period show real variation. But it happened often enough and was documented often enough by the system's own officials that no honest account of workhouse intake can leave it out. While the bath was underway, an attendant took an inmate's own clothes for what the regulations called fumigation storage, a process that in theory would return them if the person was ever discharged, and in practice often meant clothes stored so carelessly that they were unwearable by the time anyone reclaimed them, if anyone ever did. In their place, every inmate, adult, and child alike received the workhouse uniform. For men, this typically meant a coarse jacket and trousers in a rough fustian or corduroy, undyed or drab-colored, deliberately plain and deliberately uniform across the ward, so that at a glance, no man could be told apart from any other. Women received a plain dress, usually in a coarse striped or checked cotton. Depending on the union, an apron and a cap, the cap in particular carrying an unmistakable visual message: "This woman is a pauper," legible to anyone who saw her from across a street or a church aisle. Underclothes, where issued at all, were of the roughest available fabric. Shoes were heavy, ill-fitting, and issued without much regard for the individual foot inside them. And it was in this same intake process, sometimes within the very same hour, that hair was cut. Not universally, and not always to the same length, but short hair, particularly for women and children, was standard practice in many unions as a hygiene measure against lice, and it stripped away, in a single afternoon, one of the few visible markers of individual identity, and for many Victorian women, of personal dignity a poor woman still had any control over. A woman's hair was in the culture of the period deeply bound up with her sense of respectability and womanhood. To have it cut short at the direction of a workhouse porter was not merely a hygienic inconvenience, it was a specific, deliberate, and keenly felt erosion of self. Small personal possessions, the sort of thing a person carries not for its value but for what it means. A wedding ring, a locket, a child's toy, a letter, were catalogued, confiscated, and stored, the same as the clothes to be returned only upon discharge, if the item had not been lost, damaged, or simply misplaced in the intervening months or years. A person walked in with a life's worth of small accumulated meaning attached to a handful of objects, and walked out of the receiving ward with none of it on their person at all. For Joseph Radley, the intake happened almost exactly this way. He and Ellen and the 3 children were received at the Porter's Lodge of the Millbrook Union in the early afternoon, questioned about their circumstances by a clerk who had clearly asked the same questions 1,000 times before, and separated within the hour, Joseph to the men's reception ward, Ellen, the children, to the women's. He watched Ellen carried toward a different door, with George still in her arms, and Alice gripping her skirt, and he was not permitted to follow. The bathwater, when his turn came, was already the color of weak tea from the 3 men who had used it before him. He undressed in front of strangers, a small mercy being that no one looked at anyone else directly, a shared discipline of averted eyes that seemed to be the one form of privacy the men could still offer one another. His own clothes, patched at the knee and elbow, but his own, the ones Ellen had mended a dozen times, were taken and bundled with a paper tag. In their place he was handed a fustian jacket 2 sizes too large in the shoulder, and a pair of trousers that had clearly been worn by other men before him, the fabric gone shiny and thin at the knee. His boots, the one piece of his old trade he still owned and had resoled himself more times than he could count, were taken along with everything else. He would not see them again for 11 weeks. Ellen's hair, wound each morning of her marriage into the same careful knot Joseph had always liked, was cut to the collar by a workhouse attendant with a pair of household scissors, in front of Alice, who watched her mother's face carefully for some reaction and found none, because Ellen had already decided, in the 2 days since they left their rooms. That showing nothing was the only form of protection left to her. This was not incompetence. It was policy, and policy with a purpose behind it. One the Poor Law Commissioners were candid about in their own reports. Uniformity of dress and appearance served the administrative goal of the system directly. A pauper stripped of individual clothing, individual hair, and individual possessions was easier to manage, easier to count, easier to keep equal in privation to every other pauper in the same ward, and, not incidentally, easier to shame into leaving. The workhouse uniform was not simply practical. It was a visible, permanent announcement of a person's fall in status, worn on the body every hour of every day, and everyone in the surrounding town knew exactly what it meant to see someone wearing it. Conditions varied by union and by decade. Reforms through the 1,870 seconds and 1,880 seconds, driven partly by scandal and partly by a slowly shifting public conscience, improved bathing arrangements and inspection standards in some workhouses considerably. But the underlying architecture of the intake process, the deliberate stripping of identity that came before any bed was assigned or any meal was served, remained recognizably the same system Joseph and Ellen walked into in 1880 as it had been when the new Poor Law first opened its doors more than 40 years earlier. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the very first thing this system did to a person was not feed them or house them or examine their health, though all of that came soon after. The very first thing it did was make them look like everyone else who had already given up. If the intake process was the stripping of identity, what came next was the stripping of relationship itself. And it is here that most people's assumptions about workhouse life tend to be the most generous and the most wrong. If you picture a poor Victorian family entering a workhouse together, you probably picture them staying together in some rough approximation of a household, perhaps in a shared room, certainly within easy reach of one another, the way a modern shelter might house a family unit under one roof, even in difficult circumstances. The word family, after all, still applied to them. They had walked in as a family. Surely the institution treated them as one. It did not, and the separation was not incidental. It was the deliberate architecture of the system, built into the very cross-shaped floor plans the Poor Law Commissioners distributed to every union in the country. Workhouse inmates were sorted into classes upon admission, a term the regulations used quite literally, and the classes were kept physically apart in separate wings, sometimes separate buildings entirely. Able-bodied men occupied one wing. Able-bodied women occupied another. The aged and infirm of each sex were kept apart from the able-bodied of their own sex, on the theory that the old and sick should not have to witness or compete with the young and capable. Boys past infancy were separated from their mothers and housed with other boys. Girls were kept with other girls. A husband and wife who had shared a bed for 20 years might find themselves, within an hour of walking through the same gate, assigned to opposite ends of the same building, permitted to see one another only at specific, supervised times, if the rules of their particular union allowed it at all. Some unions permitted brief visits between husbands and wives, perhaps an hour on a Sunday, conducted under the eye of an attendant in a common room. Others did not permit it as a matter of course, treating any request to see one's own spouse as a special favor to be granted or refused at the master's discretion. The rule was softened somewhat over time for the elderly. Following pressure that built through the 1,840 seconds and continued for decades afterward, some unions began permitting married couples over the age of 60 to share a bedroom, a reform introduced gradually and unevenly rather than as a single national mandate. and one that still left every younger married couple in the building fully separated, regardless of how devoted the marriage or how young the children. Mealtimes, which in almost any other institution might have offered some small daily opportunity for family contact, were instead governed by rules of enforced silence. Inmates ate at long tables in their own class's dining hall. Men in one, women in another, under supervision. Talking during meals was frequently forbidden outright or restricted to a murmur, on the theory that silence maintained order and discouraged what the regulations sometimes called idle conversation. The same expectation of quiet governed the workrooms where oakum was picked or laundry was done. A woman working beside her own daughter in the same ward might go an entire day without exchanging more than a whispered word with her, under the watchful presence of a matron whose job included reporting infractions. Children under a certain age, typically around 2 or 3 years old, depending on the union, were permitted to remain with their mothers in the women's wards. Beyond that age, they were moved into the children's ward, or where the union maintained one, the workhouse school, a separate institution in every meaningful sense, run by its own schoolmaster or schoolmistress, following its own daily schedule, and offering a mother no guarantee of seeing her own child except at limited, regulated intervals. A boy of 6 or 7 might live under the same roof as his mother for years, and see her, for perhaps an hour a week, under supervision, in a common room. Neither of them had chosen, and neither of them could leave together. Peter Higginbotham's research into surviving workhouse records shows how consistently this separation held across unions of very different size and character, from small rural workhouses housing a few dozen inmates. The specific hours and privileges varied. The underlying structure, families divided by class and sex, the moment they crossed the threshold, did not. For the Radleys, the separation happened within the same hour as the bath and the change of clothes. Joseph watched Ellen carry toward the women's wing, with George still in her arms, Alice's small hand gripping her mother's skirt, and Walter trailing half a step behind, confused and silent in the particular way frightened children go silent rather than crying. He was permitted, that first evening, to walk to the low wall that separated the men's exercise yard from the women's, and stand there for perhaps 10 minutes while a porter watched the clock, exchanging with Ellen across 20 feet of gravel, the kind of stilted, urgent conversation that people have when they know exactly how little time they have been given. Alice and Walter, once past the age the union allowed children to remain with their mother, which, in the case of Walter, had already been reached, were moved to the children's ward within days, and Joseph did not see his son again for 6 weeks. He saw Alice more often, since she was still young enough to work occasional short shift, helping in the laundry alongside the women. But even those glimpses came through a doorway across a room, under the eye of a matron who did not encourage lingering. Ellen, for her part, adapted with the same quiet, deliberate composure she had shown at the moment her hair was cut. She learned within days which hours the matron was likely to be occupied elsewhere, and used them to pass Walter a scrap of information about his father, or to hold Alice's hand for the length of a hallway. It was not resignation. It was the same resourcefulness that had kept the family fed through the worst months before they arrived, redirected now toward the much smaller task of simply staying connected to the people she loved inside a system built to prevent exactly that. The stated justifications for this separation, when the guardians and commissioners bothered to offer one, tended toward the administrative and the moral in roughly equal measure. Administratively, sorting inmates by age and sex, simplified supervision, labor assignment, and the enforcement of discipline. Morally, many Victorian reformers genuinely believed, and said so in print, that mixing the sexes freely among the destitute risked encouraging immorality, and that separating children from parents who had, in the language of the era, failed to provide for them, was itself a kind of corrective, removing young minds from what was assumed to be a bad influence. Whatever the stated logic, the effect on the ground was the same in every union that applied it with any rigor. A family that entered the workhouse together left it, if they left it at all, having spent months or years living as strangers to one another under a single roof, exchanging what affection they could manage in stolen minutes across a yard or a hallway, under the eye of someone paid to make sure they did not linger. There is a particular kind of cruelty in being kept apart from someone you love, not by distance, but by 20 feet of gravel, and the presence of a watching stranger. The Radleys were, in this respect, entirely unremarkable. Everyone else in the building was managing precisely the same absence. Now, the building itself. Because the walls, the yards, and the windows of a union workhouse were never neutral architecture, and understanding how they were designed tells you most of what you need to know about how the whole system was meant to work. Picture a workhouse in your mind, and you probably picture something like a large, plain institutional building, grim perhaps, but essentially just a big house for poor people. Its design a matter of budget rather than intention. A place shaped the way it was because no one spent much thought on it. The opposite was true. Every element of a union workhouse's construction, from the height of the perimeter wall to the placement of a single window, was specified with a purpose in mind, and that purpose was control. The boundary walls surrounding most union workhouses stood well above head height, tall enough that a person standing in the yard could not see the road beyond it, and a person on the road could not easily see in. This served two functions at once. It kept the respectable townspeople from having to look at the poor they had agreed, through their poor rates, to support, and it kept the inmates from any casual contact with the world they had left, a world that might otherwise remind them daily of exactly what they were missing. The wall was not there to keep danger out. It was there to keep two separate social realities from touching. Inside that outer wall, the internal yards followed the same logic on a smaller scale. Each class of inmate, men, women, boys, girls, the aged, the able-bodied, was typically allotted its own exercise yard, walled or fenced from the others, so that even the small daily ritual of getting fresh air happened in isolation from every other group in the building. A boy might spend a year in the same institution as his mother and never once share the same open patch of sky with her, because the yards themselves were built to prevent it. The windows followed a similar principle, and this is where the architecture becomes almost uncomfortably deliberate. Windows in workhouse wards were frequently set high in the wall, above the sight line of anyone standing or sitting inside, which allowed daylight into the room while denying inmates any view of the yard, the road, or each other's wings. Some historians studying surviving workhouse plans have noted the clear resemblance between this design and the inspection principle Jeremy Bentham had articulated decades earlier in his writing on the Panopticon, the idea that a building could be arranged so that a single supervisor, positioned correctly, created the constant possibility of being watched without ever needing to watch everyone at once. The cross-shaped plan Sampson Kempthorne drew up in 1835 put a supervisor's post at the hub of the building for exactly this reason, giving one person, in theory, a clear sight line down every wing simultaneously. Whether or not any individual master actually stood there watching at any given moment mattered less than the fact that inmates could never be entirely certain he wasn't. The one place in most workhouses where every class did briefly occupy the same room was the chapel. Since Sunday worship was compulsory, nearly every union and few guardians were willing to build a separate chapel for each class of pauper. But even here, the architecture preserved the hierarchy. Pews were typically arranged and partitioned by class. Men on one side, women on the other, the aged in one block, children in another, so that a family could sit within 20 feet of one another once a week, technically together in the same act of worship, and remain as separated by the layout of the benches as they were by the walls between their wards. The rest of the week, for Joseph, the geography of his new life became clear within the first few days. His yard was a rectangle of packed earth bordered by a wall too high to see over, shared with perhaps 30 other able-bodied men, and from it he could sometimes hear, faintly, the higher voices of children at play in a yard somewhere beyond a second wall. Sound he came to recognize after a week or two as belonging specifically to the hour the children's ward was let out for exercise. He never saw that yard. He simply learned the way a prisoner learns the schedule of sounds outside a cell, what time of day the voices would carry, and stood as close to that particular wall as the yard's boundary allowed, listening for something that might have been Walter's voice among the others, though he could never be entirely sure. Sunday chapel gave him his clearest sustained view of his family in any given week. Ellen visible across the aisle in the women's section, Alice beside her, Walter 2 rows further back with the other boys his age, all of them present, all of them under the same roof and the same hymn. None of them permitted to sit together or speak before or after the service, beyond a brief, supervised moment in the yard, as the different classes filed out through their separate doors at slightly staggered times. The broader intention behind this architecture was rarely stated as bluntly as its effect suggests, but the Poor Law Commissioners and the architects who worked for them were not shy, in their own correspondence and reports, about describing classification and separation, mixing paupers of different character and different moral standing, in the language many reformers of the era actually used, risked what they saw as contamination, the corruption of the more respectable poor by association, and risked undermining the deterrent effect of the institution altogether if inmates were permitted too much comfort in one another's company. Whether this reasoning was sincere, self-serving, or some mixture of the two, the result for a family like the Radleys was identical. The building itself, its walls and its windows, and the deliberate blindness built into its yards, made sure that entering together did not mean living together, and that living together, in the loosest legal sense, was nothing at all like the word suggested. There is something worth noticing in the fact that an institution built explicitly to house the destitute poor spent so much careful architectural thought on the specific problem of making sure those people could not easily see one another. The building was in its own quiet way as much a machine for enforcing distance as the rules were. Which brings us to the question nobody inside a workhouse ever needed to ask out loud, because everyone already knew the answer before they finished forming it in their mind. What would there actually be to eat? If your picture of workhouse food comes from Oliver Twist, you probably imagine a thin, grey, watery gruel doled out in insultingly small quantities, and a room full of hungry boys watching one of their own screw up the courage to ask for more. That image has survived for well over a century for a simple reason. It was not an exaggeration. It was closer to a documentary description than most readers today assume, and the historical record behind it is considerably more detailed, and in some ways considerably harder to sit with than the novel itself had room to show. Every union workhouse operated under a dietary table, formal schedules specifying exactly what inmates would eat at each meal on each day of the week, set initially by the Poor Law Commissioners and later by their successor bodies, and revised periodically across the decades that followed the 1834 Act. These tables were not vague guidelines. They specified quantities down to the ounce, a precision that made the deliberate calculation behind them impossible to disguise as accident. A typical breakfast across many unions consisted of a set weight of bread, perhaps 6 or 8 ounces, and a pint of gruel, a thin porridge made from oatmeal and water, sometimes thickened slightly, sometimes not, and known among inmates and even in some official correspondence by the far less flattering name of skilly. Dinner, the main meal of the day, varied more by day of the week than breakfast did. Several days offered bread and cheese, or bread and broth. 1 or 2 days a week, and it was rarely more than that, offered a small ration of meat, often boiled and often the cheapest cuts available, alongside potatoes or other vegetables in season. Supper, where it existed at all as a separate meal, tended to be smaller still, often just bread, sometimes with a little more gruel or broth. The precision of these tables was the entire point. The Poor Law Commissioners calculated dietary allowances against the documented earnings and diet of the lowest paid independent agricultural laborers in the surrounding district, so that a workhouse inmate's food would never exceed, in either quantity or quality, what the poorest working person outside the workhouse could obtain by their own labor. This is the principle of less eligibility, again expressed this time not in architecture or uniform, but in ounces of bread and pints of gruel, measured and tabulated with the same bureaucratic thoroughness the system applied to everything else. Historians who have studied surviving dietary tables, among them Peter Higginbotham in his extensive cataloguing of poor law records, have noted how consistently the numbers across different unions cluster around the same deliberately modest caloric targets, and how transparently those targets were pegged to conditions outside the workhouse, rather than to any independent standard of what a working adult, let alone a working adult performing hard physical labor for 8 or more hours a day. This gap did not go entirely unnoticed at the time. Workhouse medical officers, whose job included monitoring the health of inmates required to labor, complained in official reports across several decades that the prescribed diets were inadequate for the physical work being demanded of the men and women eating them. Pressure from these complaints, along with broader shifts in medical understanding of nutrition, led to periodic revisions of the dietary tables through the middle and later decades of the century, generally increasing rations modestly, adding a little more meat or a little more bread to certain days. By 1880, the diet, most unions, was somewhat less austere than it had been in the system's earliest years, and conditions varied meaningfully from one union to the next, depending on the attitude of the local guardians. But the underlying calculation, food set deliberately at or just below what the poorest laborer could earn for himself, remained the operating principle behind every revision. The table changed. The logic behind the table did not. Joseph's first breakfast in the Millbrook Union was a bowl of thin, greyish porridge and a heel of bread, eaten in silence at a long table with perhaps 40 other men, under the eye of an attendant who walked the length of the hall, watching for anyone attempting to talk, trade portions, or linger. The porridge was warm, which was more than could be said for some of what he had eaten in the final weeks before arriving, but it was thin enough that he could see the bottom of the bowl through it, and it left him hungry again within 2 hours of finishing it. Dinner that first day was bread and a small piece of cheese, and it was not until the 3rd day of the week, a day the workhouse routine had designated for meat, that he received a portion of boiled beef small enough to finish in perhaps 6 bites. What struck him most in those first days was not his own hunger, which he had already grown accustomed to living with in the months before entering the workhouse. It was watching. On the rare occasions the schedule allowed him a glimpse of the children's ward at mealtime, how small Walter's portion looked on his plate, calibrated down by age and by a set of tables Joseph had never seen. He thought often, in those weeks, of Ellen's cooking before the trade collapsed, a stew she made with barley and whatever cheap cut of meat could be had, seasoned with a skill born of 20 years of stretching very little into just enough. he had not appreciated it properly at the time. He understood its value with a clarity that ached now that it was gone. The broader picture that emerges from surviving records is one of hunger calibrated with almost mathematical care, rather than hunger born of neglect or scarcity of supply. Unions were not, generally speaking, unable to feed their inmates more generously. They were unwilling to, because generosity contradicted the founding purpose of the institution. A workhouse where the food was genuinely comparable to what a struggling but employed family might eat at home would have failed, by the Commissioner's own stated logic, to deter anyone from staying. And a system built entirely around deterrence could not tolerate that outcome without abandoning its own reason for existing. The dietary table was, in this sense, one of the most honest documents the system ever produced, because it wrote the cruelty down in numbers and called it prudent administration. There is something quietly devastating in the fact that a hungry child's portion of food in 1880 had been calculated in advance by men who had never met that child, against the wages of a stranger working a field many miles away. The hunger was not an oversight. It was arithmetic. For Joseph, the labor waiting for him after breakfast each morning presented a challenge that had nothing to do with skill, and everything to do with simple endurance. And it introduces one of the most physically distinctive realities of workhouse life. If you imagine able-bodied paupers being put to work in a Victorian workhouse, you probably picture something resembling ordinary labor, farm work perhaps, or some form of manufacturing, tasks with a recognizable purpose that might have felt at least slightly less degrading for producing something useful in an obvious way. Some workhouses did put inmates to agricultural or garden labor, particularly in rural unions with land attached. But for a great many able-bodied men and women, especially in urban unions, and especially during bad weather when outdoor work was impossible, the standard daily task was something else entirely. A task chosen with as much deliberate calculation as the food on their plates. Oakum. Picking. Oakum was old rope, specifically rope that had been used at sea or in industry until it was too worn for its original purpose. Retired lengths of hemp cordage soaked through with tar to make it waterproof and resistant to rot. Picking oakum meant taking these stiff, tarred, often quite thick lengths of old rope and unraveling them entirely by hand, twisting and pulling and working the fibers apart strand by strand until the rope had been reduced back to loose, fluffy fiber, which was then sold on to shipbuilders and used, mixed with tar, to caulk the seams of wooden ships. Packing the gaps between planks to keep vessels watertight. It was genuine, useful work in the sense that the finished product had real commercial value, and workhouses across the country sold their inmates' oakum output to shipyards and rope merchants as a small source of income for the union. But the process of producing it was punishing in a way that had little to do with any inherent difficulty of the task, and everything to do with what it did to human hands over hours of repetition. The old tar hardened the rope fibers into something closer to wood than textile, and pulling it apart required constant, forceful pressure applied by the fingertips and thumbnails, hour after hour, day after day. Nails split and sometimes tore away entirely. The tar itself worked its way into every cut and crack in the skin, staining hands black for the duration of an inmate's stay and beyond, and the dust and fiber released into the air as the rope came apart left a fine, sticky residue on everything nearby, in the lungs of anyone working in a poorly ventilated room. Quotas were set by weight, a specific number of pounds of picked oakum required per day, depending on age, sex, and physical condition, recorded in the same meticulous ledgers the union kept for everything else, and failing to meet the quota carried consequences that ranged from a reduced meal to formal punishment, which we will come to shortly. Oakum picking was not unique to workhouses. It was also standard labor in Victorian prisons, assigned to convicts as part of a broader philosophy that treated repetitive, unpleasant, physically punishing work as morally corrective in its own right, regardless of whether the work itself required any skill or judgment. The overlap was not accidental, and it was not lost on contemporaries either. A pauper picking oakum in a workhouse yard was, for the several hours of the task, performing labor functionally identical to a convicted criminal serving a sentence, and the physical experience, the cracked hands, the tar under the nails, the monotony stretching across an entire working day. Joseph's hands, thickened by 2 decades of bootmaking, might have seemed well suited to hard manual labor at a glance, but the specific motion of picking oakum used muscles and put pressure on joints in ways his old trade never had. Within the first week, his fingertips had cracked at the same stress points as every other new arrivals. He worked in a long, low room with perhaps 24 other men, seated on benches with piles of old tarred rope between them, watched over by an attendant whose main task was ensuring the pace of work did not slacken. The tar stained his hands black within days, a stain that did not fully wash out, even in the reused bathwater of a Sunday scrub, and by the end of most days, his fingertips throbbed with the particular deep ache of overworked, cracked skin. In the women's ward, on the other side of the building, Ellen was set to the same task. Her hands, which had spent years mending clothes with careful, delicate stitches, now splitting and blackening in exactly the same way his were. The choice of oakum picking and similarly unproductive or minimally productive tasks, like stonebreaking for men in some unions, was not arbitrary, and the reasoning behind it reveals something important about how the whole system was constructed. The law establishing the new Poor Law included provisions intended to prevent workhouse labor from competing directly with private industry and the free labor market. If workhouses had put their able-bodied paupers to work at skilled trades, producing goods that competed directly with local tradesmen, those tradesmen, many of them guardians or ratepayers themselves, would have objected loudly to unpaid or barely paid pauper labor undercutting their own businesses. Oakum picking solved this problem neatly from the system's perspective. It required no significant capital investment in tools or materials beyond the rope itself, which was often obtained cheaply or at no cost from naval and merchant sources. It required no training. It could be performed indoors regardless of weather, ensuring paupers could always be kept occupied and idle hands, in the moral language of the period, always kept busy. And it competed with essentially no one, since the shipyards buying the finished oakum had no domestic industry of hand-picked oakum production to protect, the raw material being a byproduct of naval and maritime activity rather than a manufactured good in its own right. The result was a form of labor selected less for its productive value, though it did have some, than for its capacity to occupy the body painfully for a full working day without threatening anyone's livelihood outside the workhouse walls. It punished by design, not by accident, and everyone from the guardians who assigned the quotas to the paupers who filled them understood exactly what kind of work it was. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the pain in Joseph's hands each evening was not a side effect of an economy trying to put him to useful work. It was very close to the entire purpose. Oakum was not the only task assigned to able-bodied paupers in the name of keeping idle hands occupied, and the second major category of workhouse labor takes this story to a specific documented scandal, one that exposed, more clearly than almost any other single event of the century, exactly how far the logic of the system could be pushed. If you picture bone crushing as a workhouse task at all, you probably picture something unpleasant, but essentially harmless, a foul-smelling job perhaps, grinding animal bones down into meal for use as agricultural fertilizer. Disagreeable, in the way that many manual trades of the era were disagreeable, but nothing more sinister than that. The reality, in at least one documented and thoroughly investigated case, was considerably darker. Bone crushing was assigned in a number of unions, particularly in the 1842nd, as a task similar in spirit to oakum picking, physically demanding, requiring no special skill, and producing a product, bone meal, that farmers valued as fertilizer. Inmates worked with heavy hand tools, sometimes simple mallets, and later hand-operated crushing machines, breaking down bones supplied from knackers' yards, slaughterhouses, and kitchen waste into a coarse meal. The bones themselves were frequently not fully cleaned of their original flesh and marrow before they reached the workhouse yard, meaning the men assigned to crush them handled bones that still carried scraps of decayed tissue, marrow, and gristle, and worked for hours in the particular heavy smell that comes from old bone and old meat left too long. At the Andover Union Workhouse in Hampshire, in the middle years of the 1842nd, under a workhouse master named Colin McDougall, this task produced one of the most widely reported scandals of the entire poor law system. Inmates set to crushing bones, chronically underfed under the same dietary logic described earlier in this video, were discovered eating the decayed scraps of marrow and gristle still clinging to the bones they were supposed to be reducing to meal, sometimes fighting one another over bones that appeared to still carry more of it than others. This was not a rumor or an isolated complaint. It emerged with enough consistency from enough separate witnesses that it could not be dismissed, and it forced open a formal Parliamentary Select Committee investigation in 1846, one of the most searching official inquiries the poor law system had yet faced. What the Andover investigation revealed went well beyond one workhouse master's failures. It exposed chronic underfeeding as a documented, ongoing condition rather than an occasional lapse, weak and inconsistent oversight from the Central Poor Law Commission in London, and a pattern of local guardians either unaware of or unwilling to intervene in conditions severe enough to drive starving people to eat rotted scraps of animal tissue rather than go another hour without anything in their stomachs. The scandal contributed directly to a significant restructuring of the Poor Law Administration, and the Poor Law Commission itself, discredited by the affair, was replaced by a new body, the Poor Law Board, in 1847, with somewhat strengthened powers of inspection and central oversight, though still limited ones by any modern standard. By the time Joseph Radley entered the Millbrook Union 35 years later, bone crushing, as a widespread task, had largely fallen out of favor across the system, discouraged in the aftermath of Andover, and gradually replaced in most unions by oakum picking, stone breaking for men, and laundry or needlework for women as the standard forms of able-bodied labor. It had not vanished everywhere. Some smaller and more remote unions continued assigning bone-related work well into the following decades, and Millbrook was one of them, maintaining a small boneyard as a secondary task for men whose oakum quota had been met early, or who were assigned there for reasons the master rarely explained. Joseph spent perhaps a dozen days there over the course of his stay, and the smell, he told Ellen once during one of their brief supervised visits, was unlike anything he had encountered in 20 years of manual trade work. A heaviness in the air that seemed to cling to his clothes and his hands long after the day's task ended. He never went as far as the men at Andover had gone, and it is worth being honest about the fact that Millbrook in 1880, whatever its failures, was not Andover in 1845. But he understood, working in that yard with men who had clearly worked there far longer than he had, exactly why the story of Andover still circulated among paupers decades after the scandal had faded from the newspapers. It was not told as ancient history. It was told the way people tell a story about something that could still, under the wrong master and the wrong guardians, happen again, because the underlying conditions that produced it, the underfeeding, the assignment of degrading labor to already starving people, the thin oversight from London, had been reformed but never entirely removed from the system's foundations. The broader lesson historians have drawn from Andover is not that it was an aberration the system quickly corrected, but that it was an unusually visible instance of a condition present in smaller and less publicized forms across a great many unions throughout the Poor Law era. Hunger calibrated to the ounce, as the previous chapter of this story described, does not stay contained to the dinner table. Follows a person into whatever labor they are assigned, and when that labor happens to involve handling food, no matter how degraded or inedible by ordinary standards, hunger has a way of overriding the dignity a person might otherwise have insisted on maintaining. The Andover paupers who ate scraps of rotted marrow off crushing bones were not behaving strangely. They were behaving exactly the way starving human beings behave, and the scandal's real power, then and now, comes from how plainly it demonstrated that fact to a public that had preferred, until the newspapers forced the issue, not to think about it at all. There is a particular kind of grief in a system that could produce, entirely within its own official logic of thrift and deterrence, a scene like the one investigators found at Andover, and then spend decades treating that scene as a regrettable exception. Punishment, meanwhile, waited for anyone who failed to meet the day's quota, whatever that quota happened to be, and the system for administering it was every bit as formalized as the dietary tables, the classification rules that governed everything else. If you imagine discipline in a Victorian workhouse at all, you probably imagine something fairly mild, a scolding from the master perhaps, or the loss of some small privilege, the kind of correction you might expect in a strict but ultimately benevolent institution. The actual system was considerably more structured than that, and considerably closer to a penal code than a set of household rules. Every union workhouse was required to keep a punishment book, a formal ledger, recording the name of any inmate found guilty of what the regulations called disorderly or refractory conduct, along with the specific offense and the specific punishment applied. Disorderly conduct covered a wide range of behavior, failing to complete an assigned task such as an oakum quota, using profane or abusive language, quarreling with another inmate, or simple insolence toward an officer of the workhouse. Refractory conduct, a more serious category, generally covered repeated offenses or more direct defiance, refusing to work at all, destroying workhouse property, or violent behavior towards staff or other inmates. Punishments for disorderly conduct typically involved a reduced diet, most commonly a period of bread and water only, sometimes for a single meal, sometimes for a full day or more, imposed in place of the already meager standard fare. Punishments for refractory conduct could extend to confinement in a separate punishment cell, sometimes called the refractory ward, isolated from the rest of the inmate population. And in cases of repeated or serious offenses, a union could refer an inmate to the local magistrates for prosecution under the Poor Law Offences statutes. A path that could end in a genuine criminal sentence served in the county jail, complete with hard labor of its own. Historians who have examined surviving punishment books, Peter Higginbotham, prominent among them, describe records that read with an almost bureaucratic flatness given what they document: a name, a date, an offense, often no more serious than a failed quota or a sharp word to a matron, and a punishment of a day or two on bread and water, entered in the same neat hand used for every other administrative record the union kept. The flatness of the record is, in its own way, part of the story. Punishment on this scale had become so routine, so thoroughly built into the daily operation of the institution that it required no special drama to document. It was simply another line item. Children were not exempt from this disciplinary structure, though the specific punishments applied to them varied more by union and by the individual temperament of the schoolmaster or schoolmistress in charge. Corporal punishment, administered with a cane or strap, was permitted under the regulations for children in many workhouse schools, and surviving school logbooks from the period record its use for offences ranging from disobedience to poor performance in lessons. Again, in the same understated administrative language, apply to everything else in these institutions. Joseph came close to the punishment book only once during his time at Millbrook in his 3rd week, when the cracked and bleeding state of his fingertips slowed his oakum output enough that he fell short of his assigned quota 2 days running. The attendant who recorded the shortfall did not ask about the state of his hands, only noted the failure, and Joseph spent the following day on bread and water. A reduction on a diet already calibrated to the edge of adequacy left him light-headed by the evening and unable to sleep properly that night for the gnawing feeling in his stomach. He did not consider himself unfairly treated, exactly, in the sense that he understood he had fallen short of what was required of him. What struck him, lying awake that night, was how completely the system had removed any space for an explanation to matter. His hands had bled because the work itself demanded that they bleed. The punishment for the predictable result of that demand was to demand more from an already reduced body on an already reduced diet, with no acknowledgement anywhere in the ledger that the two facts might be connected. The broader purpose behind this disciplinary structure followed the same logic that shaped every other feature of workhouse life. A system built around deterrence could not simply rely on the discomfort of daily conditions to discourage people from staying. It needed a formal, escalating structure of consequences to enforce compliance with the labor and behavior it demanded, and it needed that structure recorded and reportable, so that guardians and inspectors could point to an orderly institution rather than an arbitrary one. Some unions administered this system with real severity, quick to reduce diets and quick to escalate toward magistrate referral for repeated infractions. Others, particularly by the later decades of the century, as public scrutiny of workhouse conditions increased following scandals like Andover, applied it with more restraint, reserving formal punishment for the most serious breaches and tolerating a wider margin of human failure in the daily grind of oakum quotas and laundry work. Millbrook, by most accounts, sat somewhere in the middle of that range, neither among the most notoriously harsh unions, nor among the most lenient. There is something particularly bleak in a system that could take a man's bleeding hands, produced entirely by the labor the system itself assigned him, and respond to the shortfall those hands caused by taking food from him as well. The punishment did not correct anything. It simply added one more layer of scarcity onto a body that had already been asked to give more than it reasonably could. The smell alone would have told you something was different long before you saw the rows of narrow beds, and it is worth turning now to the workhouse infirmary, because illness inside these institutions followed a logic every bit as harsh as the labor and the food that produced so much of it. If you picture a Victorian workhouse infirmary, you might imagine something reasonably close to a modest hospital ward of the period, basic by modern standards, but at least organized, reasonably clean, staffed by people whose job was specifically to help the sick recover. Some workhouse infirmaries did approach that standard, particularly the larger metropolitan institutions that by the later decades of the century had begun to develop into genuine centers of medical care. Many did not, and the gap between the two was often simply a matter of which union you happened to be unlucky enough to fall ill in. Overcrowding was the single most consistent problem across workhouse infirmaries throughout the period. Beds designed to hold one patient regularly held two, particularly during the periodic epidemics that swept through England's poorer districts across the century. And a ward built for a modest number of ordinary cases could find itself housing 3 or 4 times that number during an outbreak. with additional patients placed on makeshift pallets in hallways and common rooms. Heating was frequently inadequate, especially in winter, in wards where windows were, as we have already seen, deliberately set high and narrow, offering light, but very little in the way of effective ventilation. Ironic, given that the medical theory dominant for most of the century. The idea that disease traveled through foul air or miasma rather than through the specific contagious agents, germ theory, would only fully establish in the research coming out of the 1870 seconds and 1880 seconds, placed enormous emphasis on fresh air. Typhus, sometimes called Gale fever, for its long association with overcrowded prisons, spread easily among populations already weakened by poor diet and crowded together in inadequately washed clothing and bedding, carried by lice that thrived in exactly the conditions a workhouse ward tended to produce. Cholera arrived in a series of major national epidemics across the middle decades of the century, and wherever it struck, the overcrowded, poorly drained conditions of urban workhouses made them especially vulnerable, sometimes losing a significant portion of their inmate population within a matter of weeks when the disease found its way inside the walls. Tuberculosis, known to Victorians simply as consumption, was endemic across the entire country, regardless of class, but its transmission through close prolonged contact in poorly ventilated rooms made it especially persistent in institutional settings where dozens or hundreds of people slept and worked within a few feet of one another every day of the year. Medical care inside the workhouse was provided by a medical officer, typically a local doctor, appointed by the guardians on a part-time basis for a modest salary, responsible for the health of the entire inmate population alongside whatever private practice he maintained outside the workhouse walls. The position attracted real criticism throughout the period, from reformers and from some medical officers themselves. Overpay too low to attract sufficiently qualified applicants, and caseloads too large for any single doctor, no matter how skilled, to manage properly. For a great many of the rural and urban poor across 19th century England, the workhouse infirmary represented their only point of contact with any formal medical care at all in their entire lives. Fact, medical historians have returned to repeatedly in tracing how these same infirmaries, inadequate as they were in their own era, gradually developed the staff, the buildings, and eventually the institutional memory that would seed the general hospital system many English communities still rely on today. The Radleys' closest encounter with this reality came in their 9th week at Millbrook, when a fever, likely measles given the pattern the ward matron described, moved through the infant section of the women's ward and took hold of baby George within days of the first reported case. Ellen was permitted to remain at his bedside in the small infirmary room set aside for the youngest and sickest inmates, one of the few genuine exceptions the union separation rules allowed, since even the strictest master understood the political and practical difficulty of denying a mother access to a dying infant. Joseph was not granted the same allowance. He learned of George's illness through a message passed by a sympathetic laundry attendant, and for 11 days he worked his oakum quota with no information beyond second-hand reports carried across the yard by whoever happened to have spoken to someone in the women's wing that morning. George's fever broke on the 11th day, and he recovered, though slowly and though thinner and quieter for weeks afterward than he had been before the illness took hold. Not every family in that same ward that season was so fortunate. 2 other infants in the same nursery section died within the same span of weeks, and their names appear, the plain unembellished style of the era's record-keeping, in the Union's burial register, alongside a note of the cause and the date. One more line in a ledger that treated the death of a workhouse infant with the same brief, but procedural attention it gave to every other administrative event inside the building. The broader picture that disease paints across the whole system is one in which the very conditions the Poor Law imposed in the name of thrift and deterrence. The crowding, the shared and infrequently changed clothing, the inadequate heating, actively manufactured the epidemics that then swept through those same buildings and killed a portion of the population the institution had been built, at least nominally, to protect. Wealthier Victorians feared typhus and cholera and consumption just as much as the poor did, and took considerable pains, where they had the resources, to insulate themselves from crowding and contaminated water and poor ventilation. The poor inside a union workhouse had no such option. The building itself and the system that ran it had already decided how much air, how much heat, and how much space their bodies were entitled to, and disease moved through the gaps that decision left behind. There is something worth holding on to in the fact that George Radley lived, and in the quieter, harder fact that his survival was, in that particular ward, in that particular season, a matter of some luck alongside whatever strength his small body carried into the illness. The system had not made room for either. For Alice, the routine that shaped her days looked at first glance almost like an ordinary school, and this is one of the more quietly misleading impressions the whole system left behind. If you picture the childhood of a Victorian workhouse inmate, you might imagine something resembling a grim but genuine orphanage, children housed, fed, and educated as wards of the parish until they reached an age to make their own way. A system with real flaws. The regulations did require education, and workhouse children did attend lessons, sometimes for several hours a day. But the purpose behind those lessons, and the trajectory they were built to funnel a child toward, had very little to do with opening up possibilities for that child's future, and a great deal to do with producing, as efficiently and cheaply as possible, the next generation of laborers the surrounding economy needed. Workhouse children were legally required, under the regulations governing the new Poor Law, to receive religious and industrial training alongside basic instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic. In practice, the religious instruction, heavy on scripture and catechism, and the industrial training, hands-on tasks to prepare a child directly for future paid work, took up a significant share of the schedule, often more than the academic lessons themselves. Boys typically received instruction in a trade the union considered useful: tailoring, shoemaking, basic carpentry, or agricultural labor if the union maintained any land, while girls were trained almost universally in domestic tasks: laundry work, needlework, cleaning, and basic cooking. Skills understood from the outset to be preparing them for a future in domestic service, which was, for a poor girl of the era, very often the only respectable employment available to her at all. Because a single schoolmaster or schoolmistress was frequently responsible for teaching dozens, sometimes well over 100 children at once, many unions relied on the monitorial system, a teaching method already common in charity schools across the country, in which older or more capable children were trained to instruct groups of younger ones under the schoolmaster's general supervision. This kept costs low, since it required paying only one qualified adult rather than several, and it had the secondary effect of putting some workhouse children into a position of real responsibility for their peers' education from a remarkably young age, a responsibility with no corresponding pay, or, say in their own circumstances, beyond the schoolroom itself. The end point of this entire structure for almost every workhouse child who was not claimed by family or otherwise removed first was departure into paid work as early as the law and the guardians could arrange it. Ages varied across the century and across different types of employment, shaped by the Factory Acts that gradually restricted child labor in mills and mines. Most significantly, the Consolidating Factory and Workshop Act of 1878, which tightened rules around the minimum age and permitted hours for children in many industrial settings. But workhouse guardians who bore direct financial responsibility for every additional day a child remained on the union's books had a strong administrative incentive to place children into apprenticeships or service positions the moment they were legally eligible, sometimes younger where loopholes or less scrupulous unions allowed it. Boys were commonly apprenticed to trades, sometimes to employers many miles from the workhouse and from any family the child had left, an arrangement with a long and troubled history stretching back to the early decades of the century. When pauper apprentices had been sent by the thousands to distant textile mills under contracts, the children themselves had no power to negotiate or refuse. Girls, overwhelmingly, were placed into domestic service, entering a household as the lowest-ranking servant, often at an age that would strike a modern reader, shockingly young, with the placement arranged entirely by adults who had never met the family the child was leaving. Alice, at 9 years old, going on 10 during her family stay at Millbrook, spent her mornings in the workhouse schoolroom learning her letters and her numbers alongside perhaps 30 other girls, and her afternoons on needlework and laundry instruction that the schoolmistress described, without any particular unkindness, as preparing the girls for good situations later in life. She proved a quick reader, quick enough that within a few weeks the schoolmistress had her helping the youngest children sound out their letters during the morning lesson, a small position of trust that Alice took seriously in the specific, careful way children take on responsibility when very little else in their circumstances. Joseph, on the rare occasions he glimpsed her across the chapel aisle or through a doorway during a supervised visit, found himself doing an anxious private arithmetic of his own, counting the months against her age, aware that if the family stay stretched on for years rather than months, the union's own administrative machinery would eventually move to place her in service somewhere he might never see again, with or without his consent, simply because it was cheaper and more orderly for the guardians to have one less name on their books. The broader history behind this trajectory reflects a system that treated the raising of pauper children less as a matter of care than as a matter of economic processing, converting dependent children into independent laborers as quickly as the law allowed, with the child's own preferences or family ties given essentially no formal weight in the decision. Criticism of this approach built steadily across the middle decades of the century, particularly around the very large congregate district schools some unions operated, sometimes housing many hundreds of children, under conditions reformers came to call barrack schools, cold, institutional. By the 1872, a genuine reform movement had begun pushing an alternative, the boarding-out system placing workhouse children with foster families in ordinary homes rather than raising them inside institutional walls at all. Though it remained the exception, rather than the rule for most workhouse children across the country, Alice among them. There is a particular kind of quiet dread in watching a child you love grow older inside a system. That is, quite literally, counting down the months until it can put her to work in someone else's house. Alice did not know she was being counted. Joseph did, and he carried that private arithmetic with him through every oakum quota and every bread and water day that followed. There is one more chapter to this story, and it concerns what happened to a person's body after the workhouse had finished with everything else. And it is, of everything covered so far, the fact that tends to surprise people the most when they first learn it. You might reasonably assume that whatever else a workhouse got wrong, at least it saw a person properly buried when they died, some plain grave, some brief service, the minimal dignity a Christian country of the period would have insisted on for even its poorest dead. For a great many workhouse deaths, that assumption held. Union burial grounds across the country hold the remains of thousands of paupers laid to rest, without ceremony but without further indignity either. For a portion of workhouse deaths, particularly among the elderly, the friendless, and the estranged, something considerably darker, was legally possible, and had been since 1832. The Anatomy Act of 1832 was passed in direct response to a scandal that had horrified the country in the years just before it: the exposure of so-called resurrection men, criminals who robbed fresh graves and sold the bodies to anatomy schools desperate for cadavers to teach medical students. Trade that reached its most infamous extreme in Edinburgh in 1828, when William Burke and William Hare were discovered to have moved beyond grave robbing into outright murder in order to keep the supply flowing. The public outrage that followed forced Parliament to address the anatomy school's genuine and pressing need for bodies through some legal channel, rather than leaving that need to be met by criminals digging up the recently buried. The solution lawmakers settled on was the Anatomy Act, which permitted the bodies of those who died unclaimed in workhouses, hospitals, and prisons to be legally handed over to anatomy schools for dissection. The word doing the most damage in that sentence is unclaimed, because in practice, whether a body was claimed or not had very little to do with whether that person had loved ones, and a great deal to do with whether those loved ones had the money, the proximity, and the practical means to claim it in time. Claiming a body meant paying for its removal and its burial, an expense a struggling family, itself, perhaps, still inside the same workhouse, or another one entirely frequently could not manage. Distance mattered too. A family that had scattered across the country looking for work, as so many poor Victorian families did, might simply never learn in time that a parent or sibling had died in a particular union's infirmary before the window to claim the body had closed. The historian Ruth Richardson, whose research into the Anatomy Act traced its consequences in careful detail, has documented how thoroughly the burden of this law fell on the poor specifically, since the wealthy dead were, by definition, a family with means simply came and buried its own. The Anatomy Act, whatever its stated even-handedness, functioned in practice as a law that reserved dissection, and the loss of a proper burial that came with it, overwhelmingly for those who died with no one able to reach them in time, or no one left to reach them at all. For the Victorian poor, this was not an abstract legal technicality. Fear of dissection ran deep across working-class culture, tied to genuine religious conviction about bodily resurrection, and to a simple, powerful sense that a person deserved to be laid to rest whole and undisturbed. Workhouse inmates understood the calculation hanging over the friendless and the elderly in their midst with a clarity that rarely needed to be spoken aloud. An old man with no family to write to, or no family willing to answer, faced not only the prospect of dying inside the workhouse walls, but the real possibility that his body, rather than his soul, would be the last thing anyone in his family ever heard about, and that the news, if it came at all, would arrive too late to matter. Joseph came to understand this most clearly through an elderly man in his own ward named Enoch, a former agricultural laborer with no living children that anyone in the workhouse knew of, who had been at Millbrook for several years by the time Joseph arrived, and who spoke of his own likely fate with a resignation that unsettled Joseph more than any complaint would have. Why? Enoch died during Joseph's stay, quietly, in the infirmary, and no family ever came forward to claim him within the period the union allowed. Joseph never learned for certain what became of Enoch's body afterward, since the union's own records on such matters were kept with a discretion that bordered on evasiveness, but the men in his ward spoke of it in the same hushed, matter-of-fact way they spoke of Andover. One more indignity available to a man whose life had already been stripped of nearly every other kind of dignity the workhouse could take. It is worth pausing here on the novel most people already associate with this entire subject, because the connection runs deeper than most readers realize. Charles Dickens published Oliver Twist in serial form between 1837 and 1839, only a few years after the New Poor Law itself, and the workhouse in which Oliver is born, presided over by the beadle Mr. Bumble, and the scene of young Oliver's famous request for more gruel was not a piece of pure invention. The scholar Ruth Richardson, in research connecting the novel directly to Dickens' own biography, traced the fictional workhouse to a real institution the young Dickens lived beside during a difficult stretch of his childhood in London on Cleveland Street, giving the novel's satire a grounding in specific, remembered, physical reality rather than general moral outrage alone. Dickens wrote Oliver Twist as an indictment of the New Poor Law's cruelty, while that cruelty was still a fresh and current policy, not a historical curiosity, and the novel became, almost immediately, the version of the workhouse most of the reading public carried in their minds from that point onward. What the novel left out, whether from narrative choice or simple decorum, was the fate that awaited Enoch and men and women like him. Dickens gave his readers hunger and cruelty and the casual violence of Mr. Bumble's authority. He did not take his readers into the Anatomy Act's particular calculation, the specific horror of a body becoming, in the absence of anyone able to claim it, one more resource for the system to allocate. In this one respect, the documented historical reality of the New Poor Law reached further into darkness than even Dickens, writing at the height of his outrage, chose to take his fiction. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that a system built to manage poverty through hunger and labor and enforce separation followed its subjects past the point of death itself, still calculating, still sorting the claimed from the unclaimed, still finding one more use for a body that had already given the workhouse everything else it had asked of it. There was another population moving through Millbrook that Joseph noticed only gradually, glimpsed at first as a line of shapes at the outer gate each evening as the light failed, and it belonged to a category of poverty the system treated with even less patience than his own. If you picture a destitute traveler in Victorian England, a man walking from town to town in search of work with no fixed home to return to, you might assume he simply slept rough where he could and was turned away from any institution that had its own settled population to look after. Burden nobody official wanted, and nobody official was required to manage. In truth, the law placed a very specific duty on every union workhouse to provide food and a night's shelter to any destitute wayfarer who applied for it, a duty that had existed in one form or another since long before the New Poor Law itself. What the law did not require was that this shelter be pleasant, and unions took full advantage of that distinction. Dr. Gashel wards, known among the traveling poor themselves by the slang name the Spike, were typically housed in a separate part of the workhouse grounds, sometimes an entirely separate building near the gate, with their own entrance, so that casual paupers, as they were officially called, never needed to mix with the settled inmate population inside. The regime inside a casual ward was built to be harder, not easier, than the regular workhouse, on the theory that anything more comfortable would encourage vagrancy rather than discourage it. A new arrival underwent much the same intake as any other pauper, questioned, stripped, bathed, often in water, no fresher than what the regular wards received, and issued a coarse nightshirt in place of whatever clothes he travelled in, which were taken and searched, partly for vermin and partly for any money or valuables that might have made the pauper's claim of complete destitution questionable. Sleeping arrangements in many casual wards amounted to little more than a plank bed or a heap of straw in a narrow cell, sometimes shared with several other men in a single small room, a step down even from the already spare dormitories of the ordinary workhouse. The following morning, before any casual pauper was permitted to leave, he was required to perform what the regulations call the labor test, most commonly breaking a specified quantity of stone down to a size small enough to pass through an iron grill of fixed dimensions, or picking a strict quota of oakum. The same task assigned to the settled, able-bodied inmates, calibrated for casual paupers to a standard many contemporaries considered even more demanding relative to the single night's food and shelter received in exchange. Only once this task was completed, to the satisfaction of the porter or master, was the pauper released, typically forbidden from returning to the same union's casual ward again for a set period, a rule specifically designed to prevent what officials of the era called professional tramping, a circuit of workhouses, itinerant lodging system, rather than a genuine last resort between periods of settled work. Underlying all of this was a much older piece of English law, the settlement system, which assigned every person a specific parish of legal settlement, generally the parish of their birth, or of some fixed period of prior residence and employment, and made that parish, and that parish alone, legally responsible for their poor relief. A man who travelled from his home county in search of work, as the economic dislocations of the era pushed enormous numbers of labouring people to do, carried his settlement with him like an invisible debt owed by a place he might not see again for years, and if he fell destitute far from that parish, temporary obligation to him, precisely the one night's shelter, food, the casual ward provided, before he was expected to move on, either back toward his own parish or onward in search of the work that had sent him travelling in the first place. Joseph first noticed the casual ward's population as a line of figures gathering at Millbrook's outer gate most evenings as the light failed men, and occasionally women, in clothes worn thin by travel, waiting to be admitted for the single night the law entitled them to. He fell into conversation once across the low wall separating the men's exercise yard from the yard. The casual paupers used the following morning to complete their labor test, with a laborer perhaps 5 years younger than himself, a man who gave his name simply as Sam and said he had been walking from union to union for the better part of 2 months. Following rumors of harvest work and railway construction that kept receding just ahead of him by the time he arrived, Sam broke his morning's quota of stone with the flat, practice motion of someone who had done it in a dozen other yards before this one. And when Joseph asked him where he was headed next, Sam answered with a shrug that suggested the question itself assumed a kind of certainty he no longer had the luxury of holding. Joseph, for all the hardship of his own family's situation, understood after that conversation that Millbrook had at least given him something Sam did not have, a fixed place, grim as it was, and the prospect, distant as it remained, of returning to it each night, rather than walking on toward the next union's gate by morning. Historians who have studied the scale of vagrancy in this period note that the population moving through casual wards each year ran into the hundreds of thousands nationally, a figure that reflects both genuine economic desperation, men and women following real or rumored work across an increasingly industrial and railway-connected country, and the harder edge of contemporary opinion, which drew a sharp and often ungenerous distinction between the deserving traveller seeking honest work and what the era's officials like to call the habitual or professional tramp, a distinction the casual ward's deliberately harsh regime, regardless of which category any individual actually belonged to. There is something worth noticing in a system that built an entire separate, harsher tier of punishment specifically for people whose only offence was having no fixed parish willing to claim them, on top of a system that had already built its ordinary tier around punishing poverty itself. Sam broke his stone and walked on before nightfall the next day, and Joseph never learned what became of him after that, which was, in its own way, exactly how the system was built to work. One more figure shaped the Randleys' daily experience more directly than any regulation printed in London ever could, and it is worth pausing on him before we step back to look at the whole picture this story has been building toward. You might assume, given how thoroughly this video has described the dietary tables, the classification rules, the punishment books, and the labor tests, that a workhouse ran itself almost mechanically, a fixed set of national regulations applied identically wherever a union happened to sit, with little room left for any individual person's judgment to matter very much. On paper, a great deal of the system did work exactly that way. In daily practice, an enormous amount of what actually happened to any given inmate depended on one specific person, the workhouse master, and his counterpart, the matron, typically his wife, who together held nearly total day-to-day authority over the inmates in their care. The master was appointed by the local board of guardians, usually from among candidates with some prior experience in institutional management, though the position paid modestly enough and demanded enough unpleasant daily labor of its own, that the pool of willing and well-qualified applicants was not always large. Once appointed, the master exercised wide discretion over the texture of daily life inside the walls, even within rules that looked, in the official regulations, quite rigid. He decided how strictly the dietary table was enforced down to the last ounce, or whether a kitchen matron quietly rounded a portion upward on a hard day. He decided which infractions reached the punishment book and which were let pass with a warning. He decided, as Millbrook's master had decided in the case of baby George's fever, when an official rule about separating families might bend slightly under circumstances that made rigid enforcement feel needlessly cruel even to a man whose job was largely to enforce exactly that kind of rigidity. Central oversight of this enormous local discretion was, for most of the century, remarkably thin. The Poor Law Commission, and later the Poor Law Board and the local government board that succeeded it, employed a small number of inspectors responsible for visiting and reviewing conditions across a very large number of unions spread across a great deal of English countryside, a ratio that made frequent, thorough inspection of any single workhouse difficult to sustain in practice. This was precisely the gap that allowed conditions at Andover to deteriorate as far as they did before anyone in London took real notice. And, while the scandal prompted real reforms to inspection practice, the underlying arithmetic, a handful of inspectors covering an enormous territory, remained a persistent limitation on central oversight right through the period the Radleys entered Millbrook. The result, one that historians combing surviving records across many different unions have documented again and again, is that a pauper's actual quality of life could vary enormously between two workhouses operating under identical national regulations, and the Board of Guardians who appointed and supervised them chose to apply those regulations with rigid severity or with whatever small, unofficial humanity the position allowed for. Peter Higginbotham's research into surviving records makes this variability one of the clearest through lines across the entire history of the system. Unions, a few counties apart, producing wildly different lived experiences for people facing, on paper, Millbrook's master, a man named Hollis who had held the position for a little over a decade by 1880, was neither a monster nor anything approaching a benefactor. He enforced the labor quotas and the punishment book with a consistency that Joseph found genuinely difficult during his worst weeks. And he showed no particular warmth toward any inmate in his charge. But he was also the man who quietly permitted Ellen to remain at George's bedside beyond what the official separation rules technically allowed, and the man who, on at least one occasion the other men in Joseph's ward discussed in low voices, had looked the other way when an elderly inmate, too weak to complete his oakum quota, was marked down for a lighter punishment than the book strictly called for. None of this made Hollis a kind man in any way that would have registered as kindness outside these walls. It made him an ordinary man exercising the considerable, largely unsupervised discretion his position granted him, sometimes towards strictness, and sometimes in small and unofficial ways away from it. This is, in its own quiet way, one of the more unsettling truths this whole system reveals. The cruelty documented across these chapters, the hunger calibrated to the ounce, the bleeding hands, the families kept 20 feet and one watching stranger apart, did not require an especially cruel man standing at the center of it giving orders. It required only an ordinary system of rules, designed with deterrence as its explicit purpose, administered by ordinary people working within a structure of oversight too thin to catch most of what happened at the local level, whether that local level tilted, on any given day, toward strict compliance or toward a small dot. Done recorded mercy nobody in London would ever know about. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that Joseph's family's daily suffering depended less on the law printed in the regulations than on the particular temperament of one man named Hollis, appointed to his post by a handful of local guardians, answerable to an inspection system that could visit his workhouse only rarely, and, within that enormous gap, to be exactly as harsh or exactly as human as his own character allowed. Eventually, for most families who entered a workhouse in 1880, there came a day of leaving, and the manner of that leaving carried its own set of realities that rarely make it into the popular picture of these institutions. You might assume that once a family found its footing again, work returned, health recovered, some relatives' help arrived, the workhouse simply released them back into ordinary life, and the entire episode closed behind them like a door. Popular imagination has generally treated the workhouse as a place people entered, and in the worst cases, never left a permanent sentence rather than a temporary refuge. For a portion of the workhouse population, the elderly with no other resource, the chronically ill, orphan children with no family to claim them, that picture held true, sometimes for the rest of a person's life. But for a very large share of admissions, particularly able-bodied families like the Radleys, the workhouse functioned as exactly what its own records called it, temporary indoor relief measure, entered during a specific crisis and left again once that crisis passed. The discharge process itself was straightforward by comparison with everything that preceded it. An inmate wishing to leave was required to give notice to the master, generally on short notice measured in hours rather than days, after which the union returned whatever remained of the inmate's own clothing stored since the day of admission, along with any small possessions confiscated at intake. The condition of these returned items varied enormously depending on how carefully any given union had stored them, and it was not unusual for clothes to have suffered real damage from damp, poor storage, or simple neglect during months or years of confinement in a union storeroom. What surviving poor law records reveal most clearly about this pattern is just how often repeated. Contemporaries use the phrase ins and outs to describe the substantial portion of the workhouse population who cycled through admission and discharge repeatedly, sometimes several times within a single year, driven by the same seasonal and economic forces that had pushed them in the first time. A bad winter, slow trade, died. An illness that cost the family its meager savings all over again, just as it had begun to recover. This pattern complicates the popular image of the Victorian workhouse considerably. For many of the able-bodied poor, it was not a single catastrophic fall from which there was no return, but a recurring feature of an economic life lived permanently close to the edge, one crisis away from needing the parish again and often returning to the very same union. The stigma that followed a family out through the gate, however, did not dissipate nearly so quickly as the paperwork did. Neighbors, prospective employers, and the wider community in a small or mid-sized English town generally knew or could easily learn whether a given family had spent time in the workhouse and that knowledge carried real social weight. Having been in the house, as the phrase was often put, could affect a man's prospects of finding steady work with an employer who preferred not to hire someone the parish had once had to support, could affect a young woman's prospects of a good marriage. Quietly cruel way that childhood associations tend to persist in small communities long after the adults involved have stopped actively discussing them. For Joseph, the day of leaving came in his 14th week at Millbrook, arriving by a route that carried its own particular irony. Word reached him through another inmate that one of the mechanized boot factories that had helped put his own trade out of business was hiring hands to operate its soul sewing machines. Work that required none of his old handcraft skill, but paid a wage. Modest as it was, Joseph, 40 years old and past the point of any pride standing in the way of feeding his family, applied and was accepted. He gave the master notice the same afternoon. Ellen's clothes, when returned to her, still bore the same careful mending she had done herself months earlier, though damp had left a faint mildew smell in the fabric that no amount of washing afterward ever fully removed. Alice, Walter, and George were collected from their respective wards, and the family walked back out through the same gate they had entered 14 weeks before, dressed once more in their own worn clothes rather than the workhouse uniform, though Ellen's hair, cropped to the collar the day they arrived, would take the better part of 2 years to grow back to the length it had been. They returned to a set of rented rooms in the same town, smaller than their old ones, and Joseph reported for his first shift at the boot factory within the week, operating machinery that could turn out in an hour what would have taken him a full day of hand-stitching to produce, a fact he noted to Ellen once quietly, without any particular bitterness left in him to spend on it. The neighbors who had watched the family's furniture disappear piece by piece the previous winter knew, in the way small communities always know these things, exactly where the Radleys had spent the past several months, and Joseph and Ellen carried that knowledge with them into every subsequent interaction in the neighborhood. An unspoken fact that shaped how certain doors opened and certain doors did not, for years longer than the 14 weeks themselves had lasted. This was in the end an entirely ordinary outcome by the standards of the system the Radleys had passed through. They were neither an exceptional tragedy nor an exceptional triumph. They were one family among an enormous, largely uncounted number who entered a union workhouse during a specific hard season, endured what the system asked of them, and left again carrying both their lives and a mark on those lives that the paperwork itself. Step back now from the particular details, the bathwater and the bleeding fingertips and the bone dust and the ledgers, and a handful of patterns emerge that connect everything this story has covered, patterns that say something larger about the era than any single chapter could on its own. The first is the simplest to state and the hardest to sit with. None of what happened to the Radleys, or to Sam, or to Enoch, or to the 2 infants who did not survive that season's fever, was an accident of poor administration or insufficient resources. It was doctrine, argued for in print, passed into law, and defended by name. The principle of less eligibility was not a euphemism the poor law commissioners were embarrassed by. It was the organizing idea behind the dietary tables measured to the ounce, the uniform designed to announce a person's fall in status, the labor chosen specifically for its capacity to punish rather than to produce, and the punishment book that turned a bleeding, exhausted man's shortfall into one more entry demanding one more day without food. Every specific cruelty this story has described traces back to that single doctrine, applied with remarkable consistency across a system built by people who considered themselves, by the standards of their own time, rational reformers rather than architects of suffering. The second pattern concerns the sheer thoroughness with which that doctrine reached into every register of a person's life. It was not enough to make the food inadequate. The system also had to strip away the clothes a person walked in wearing, the hair a woman had spent years growing and caring for, the small objects that carried, meaning no ledger could measure. It was not enough to separate a family administratively. The walls had to be built tall enough, the windows placed high enough, the yards divided carefully enough that a husband and a wife living under the same roof could go days without a clear sight line to one another. It was not enough to demand labor. The labor itself had to be chosen for its capacity to injure rather than to build anything the worker could take pride in. And it was not enough that this reached stop at the boundary of a person's life. It followed a body past death itself, sorting the claimed from the unclaimed, finding one more use for whatever the workhouse had not already taken. The third pattern is, in some ways, the most unsettling, because it resists the comfortable idea that suffering on this scale required villains to produce it. Colin McDougall at Andover was a specific man whose specific failures a parliamentary committee eventually documented in detail. But the master Joseph and Ellen actually lived under a man named Hollis, was neither cruel by temperament nor especially merciful. An ordinary functionary enforcing an ordinary set of rules with the ordinary mixture of strictness and small private exceptions that most people apply to any job they hold. The system did not need Hollis to be a monster. It needed only enough administrative distance between London and Millbrook, enough thin and infrequent inspection, enough discretion left in the hands of whichever local men happened to hold it, for cruelty on a significant scale to become simply how things were done, unremarkable enough that it barely required comment from the people carrying it out. And the fourth pattern is the one this story has tried hardest to keep in view alongside the other three, because without it the whole account risks becoming a catalogue of misery rather than a portrait of people. Inside a system built with such thoroughness to strip away comfort, identity, and connection, Ellen still found the 10 minutes in a week when the matron's attention lapsed and used them to hold her daughter's hand the length of a hallway. Joseph still stood at a low wall, listening for a voice he could not be certain was his son's, and still did the quiet, private arithmetic of a father, trying to protect a future the institution had no interest in protecting for him. Enoch still spoke of his likely fate with a resignation that was its own kind of dignity, refusing to pretend the danger away, and refusing, too, to let it break him before it arrived. Sam still walked from union to union with whatever remained of his own hope for honest work, breaking his morning stone with the flat, unbothered motion of a man who had decided not to let the task define what he thought of himself. None of this softened what the system did. It simply proved, chapter after chapter, that the system never fully succeeded in reducing the people inside it to the categories its ledgers assigned them. This is in the end what the Radleys' 14 weeks at Millbrook actually reveal, and what the whole of this story has been building toward. A doctrine written by reasonable men in comfortable rooms, applied with a thoroughness that reached from the food on a plate to the disposal of a corpse, administered day to day by ordinary people whose personal character mattered more than any regulation printed in London. By human beings who kept finding some way to remain themselves inside a machine explicitly built to make that as difficult as possible. That is the shape of the year 1880 that the county newspaper's admiring paragraph never printed, and it is worth returning now to that paragraph, and to the building it described, with everything this story has since made visible. A board of guardians stands in a gravel forecourt in the English Midlands, in the spring of 1880, admiring a building they are rather proud of. The brick is still faintly pink with newness. The mortar has not yet taken on the permanent damp stain of an English winter. A reporter from the county paper is composing, in his head, the same admiring sentence he composes for every new public building in the district. Commodious, airy, a credit to the parish. This is the image this story opened with, and it is worth looking at it again now, with everything that has happened inside those walls sitting plainly in view. You are looking at a building whose fresh bathwater would be the color of weak tea by the third or fourth person to use it that morning. You are looking at a building where a woman's hair, wound each day of her marriage into the same careful knot her husband liked, would be cut to the collar by a pair of household scissors within an hour of her arrival in front of her own daughter. Because the regulations called it a hygiene measure, and nobody in the chain of authority above her was required to ask if she minded. You are looking at a building whose tall, narrow windows were placed exactly where they were placed, so that light could enter a ward without a view of the yard or the road or the family on the other side of it ever entering along with it. You are looking at a building where a man's fingertips would crack and bleed, picking apart tarred rope for a quota calculated by weight, and where, failing that quota, for any reason including the bleeding itself, meant a day of bread and water on top of a diet already measured to the ounce against the wages of the poorest laborer in the district. You are looking at a building that kept a punishment ledger in the same neat administrative hand it used for everything else, and a burial register that recorded a dead infant's name with the same brief procedural attention. You are looking at a building where an old man with no children left to claim him understood, without needing to be told directly, that his body might end its existence on a dissecting table rather than in a grave, simply because nobody arrived in time to say otherwise. And you are looking at a building where a woman named Ellen Radley found inside all of that 10 stolen minutes most weeks to hold her daughter's hand the length of a hallway, and where a man named Joseph stood at a low wall listening for a boy's voice among a dozen others, unable to be certain it was his son's and unwilling to stop listening anyway. You are looking at a building where an itinerant laborer named Sam broke his morning stone with the unbothered rhythm of a man who had decided the task would not be permitted to define him, and where a master named Hollis, neither cruel nor kind in any way the record would note, occasionally bent a rule by a small and unofficial degree when the alternative felt, even to him, needlessly hard. None of this was visible from the gravel forecourt where the guardians stood admiring their brick. None of it made its way into the county paper's approving paragraph. It was, every bit of it, exactly as real as the architecture the paper described, and considerably more true to what the building actually was. 10 years after that spring morning, the brick has weathered to the soot grey the whole district's buildings eventually take on, indistinguishable by then from any other municipal structure in the town. And Joseph Radley, older, greyer himself, thickened a little around the middle by years of steady factory work, still occasionally passes the Millbrook Union's outer wall on his way to an early shift, the same wall that once separated him from Ellen by 20 feet of packed gravel and a watching porter's clock. He does not stop. He does not, most mornings, even slow his pace, but he glances at the gate the way a person glances at a scar on their own hand, without drama, without needing to explain the glance to anyone walking beside him, simply registering, for the half-second it takes to pass, that the ordinary-looking building behind that wall knows things about him that no one on the street around him will ever know unless he chooses, which he rarely does, to tell them. Ellen's hair grew back within 2 years, though she wore it differently afterward than she had before, shorter and simpler. Small permanent change that neither of them ever discussed directly. Alice, spared by 14 weeks rather than 14 years from the placement into service the union's own arithmetic had been counting toward, grew up in her parents' rented rooms and eventually found work of her own in a shop rather than a stranger's kitchen. a distinction her father understood the value of more than she ever fully would. Walter remembered almost nothing of his 6 weeks in the boys' ward by the time he was grown. Only a general wordless unease around large institutional buildings that he could never quite explain to anyone who asked. George, who nearly did not survive the fever that swept his infant ward, grew into a quiet, watchful child, and then a quiet, watchful man, the kind of person who kept careful track of what was in the larder at all times, a habit his mother recognized immediately and never once commented on. On a Sunday some years later, with the boot factory closed for the day and a modest joint of meat on the table that Ellen had learned to stretch across 3 meals rather than 1, Joseph found himself watching his family eat in a silence that had nothing to do with any rule enforced by an attendant walking the length of a dining hall. It was simply the ordinary quiet of a family finishing a meal together. Alice reaching for a second potato without asking permission, Walter arguing mildly with his brother over the last piece of bread, Ellen watching all 3 of them with the specific, unhurried attention of a woman who had once been permitted only 10 stolen minutes a week to watch her children at all. Nobody at that table announced how remarkable the silence was, because to them it was not remarkable in the least. It was simply Sunday dinner, the kind available to any family whose luck had held long enough to afford one. Joseph understood, in a way he rarely spoke aloud, that the ordinariness of that meal was itself the entire achievement, the thing the system had never intended to let them have back so easily. And the thing they had gotten back anyway, 1 modest joint of meat and 1 unsupervised conversation at a time. Ellen, for her part, kept 1 small habit from those 14 weeks that she never fully explained to anyone, not even Joseph. Each night, once the children were settled, she checked that every door in their rooms could be reached without asking anyone's permission, that no wall separated her from any one of them by more than the width of an ordinary hallway. It was not fear, exactly, by the time enough years had passed. It was closer to a private accounting, the same instinct for careful management that had once stretched a single stew across a week of thin meals, now turned toward making certain that the particular kind of distance the Millbrook Union had once placed between her and her own children. They were not, any of them, the case entries. Their names became for 14 weeks in a leather-bound admissions book at the Millbrook Union. They were a family that had run out of every option but one, that walked through a gate built specifically to make walking through it feel like the worst choice available, short of watching their children starve, and that walked back out again, 14 weeks later, carrying both their lives. They were resourceful in ways the system never credited them for, and quietly exhausted in ways the system never acknowledged causing. They were, in the plainest, most important sense, exactly what every person who ever passed through those gates in 1880 actually was: ordinary people meeting an extraordinary demand for endurance with whatever ordinary strength they had left to meet it. Joseph and Ellen Radley are, in the plainest sense, composite figures built from the documented patterns that Peter Higginbotham, Ruth Richardson, and generations of poor law scholarship have traced across thousands of surviving admissions books, dietary tables, punishment ledgers, and burial registers. But the family they represent was never a small or marginal one. Across England and Wales in these closing decades of the 19th century, hundreds of thousands of people spent at least some portion of any given year inside a union workhouse, the overwhelming majority of them entering, as the Radleys did, during a specific crisis of unemployment, illness, or old age, and leaving again once that crisis had passed. Sometimes after weeks, sometimes after years, sometimes returning within the same 12 months to begin the whole cycle over again. Every specific detail this story has described, the bathwater, The cropped hair, the oakum, the bone dust, the dietary tables measured to the ounce, the punishment book, the fever ward, the schoolroom, the unclaimed dead, happened not once to one unlucky family but many thousands of times over. To many thousands of families whose names survive today only as entries in a leather-bound ledger, if they survive at all. This is, in the end, why a story like this one is worth telling slowly, and worth telling with the same patient attention a historian gives to a fragile document or an archaeologist gives to a single fragment of pottery. Not to assign blame across a distance of a century and a half that makes blame a fairly hollow exercise. Not to congratulate the present for having moved past it, when the underlying instinct to make relief conditional on suffering has never entirely vanished from how societies think about poverty, even now. Simply to see clearly, for a few hours in the quiet of an evening, what an ordinary family in an ordinary crisis actually walked through in the year 1880, in a building their own community was, at the very same time, praising as a credit to the parish. The brick building still stands in one form or another, in a great many English towns today, repurposed now as flats, or offices, or simply left to weather further behind a wall no longer quite as tall as it once needed to be. Most people who pass it never think to ask what it once was, and there is no particular reason they should, since nothing about its surface then or now was ever built to tell them. But the people who lived inside those walls in 1880 were real in every specific and physical sense that matters, and the story their bodies actually lived through deserves better than the silence the century after them mostly gave it. The lamps are low tonight, and the truth of it has been told as plainly as this story knows how to tell it. Not the version in the county paper with its admiring talk of fresh brick and good ventilation. Not the version the Guardians preferred to imagine as they stood in that gravel forecourt in the spring light of 1880, satisfied with an impression that never once had to account for what their own regulations produced inside the walls behind them. The version that actually happened, quietly, one day at a time, in a building that was never as simple as its own front gate made it look, and in the ordinary and remarkable lives of the people who walked through that gate, and in time walked back out of it again. Sleep well.